Morning, guys. Welcome back to another Meaningful Monday. My name is Ruby Harrell. Thanks for tuning in. First of all, I am extremely tired. I don't know why, but it just feels one of those Mondays. But yeah, moving forward in terms of Meaningful Mondays, today we're talking about assessments and specifically the MBTI, but we're talking about assessments actually more generally. We're going to use the MBTI because it's a convenient, easy example that a lot of folks are already familiar with and either have used in some fashion or another. But this literally applies to every single assessment out there. And so, first of all, backing up, what is an assessment for those of you who are not familiar with one? In whether you're in a coaching engagement or going into a company where personal development and leadership development is important, and professional development, frankly, a lot of times they'll use these kinds of assessments, whether they're leadership assessments or personality assessments, to kind of gauge where you're at and see where you want to invest time and energy and training dollars to help yourself grow. Now, these can be really powerful tools that are very effective, honestly, and they give a lot of insights that you wouldn't otherwise see that are kind of under the hood. But a lot of times people use these assessments incorrectly. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how to use them properly and how not to use them properly, as well as what the difference is between leadership assessments and personal assessments, because they are a little bit different. So again, using the MBTI as an example, it stands for the Myers-Briggs, sorry, the Myers-Briggs T. What does the T stand for? Crap. Something index, but whatever. The point is It's called the Myers-Briggs. I'm blanking on what the T stands for, and I apologize for that. But what it is it's a personality assessment. It's not a leadership assessment. It's a personality assessment. And the Myers-Briggs tells people kind of where they're at on a continuum in terms of these four different categories, right? And so it's whether you're introverted or extroverted. So you've heard people say INTJ or ENTP or those kind of things, right? So it's introverted extroversion. It's going to also talk about kind of whether you like to be alone or whether you like to be often work alone or work with others, and talks about basically are you more kind of judgmental or are you leaning to more of your feelings, kind of where you're at. So it's really a cool assessment in the sense that it talks about different behaviors, different styles of working. Now, where it falls flat, and it doesn't. I know it actually doesn't fall flat because it's not meant to be a leadership assessment. It doesn't talk about leadership, right? It doesn't talk about leadership styles, those kind of things. It talks about conflict style stuff a little bit, but it doesn't really talk about leadership. And so that's what makes it a leadership and not a personality assessment, not a leadership assessment. Now, there's a leadership assessment like the Hogan, for example. The Hogan Assessments is comprised of three different assessments, right? You have the Hogan, which I'm again forgetting these names, I apologize. But the three assessments. One is basically where you shine, what lights you up. One is kind of your pitfalls, kind of where what holds you back, and then the third one is kind of what your goals are and what motivates you, right? So the motivator index for you. And that's the Hogan assessment, right? There's also the Leadership Circle 360. There's a lot of 360 assessments, as well as the one-off assessments that kind of, depending on what you want to go for and what kind of feedback you want to elicit from yourself or from other people. But there's value in all those assessments if you use them correctly. Now, the incorrect way to use them, which a lot of people tend to do, is to define themselves by them, right? And say, I am X. For example, with, again, the MBTI, I am an ENTJ, right? That's what I am, period. And so now that becomes a backward rationalization for everything you do. Oh, I'm just an ENTJ, that's what I do, right? Or I'm just this is what I do. People might hear this from people who use horoscopes. Oh, I'm just a Gemini. That's just my Gemini coming out. I'm such a Gemini. I'm such a this or that. And at the end of the day, it's not any of those things that really defines you. It's your kind of, you can always choose how to behave. You may have a tendency towards something, right? You may have a proclivity to act a certain way, but you ultimately have a choice. So just justifying it by saying, oh, this is just my X coming out, or this is because I'm an ENTP or NTJ or INT, whatever. It's rationalization. It's a rationalization, right? And so you don't want to get caught in that situation because that's taking the choice away from you. And ultimately, we always have a choice of how we want to behave. Now, the way to use that assessment is to say, okay, this is where my tendencies lie, right? Because if you look at the MBTI report, the MBTI report actually is a continuum. So you have two different, what do you want to call, two different sides. And then in the very, very middle, you have a middle line. Now, some people who fall in the middle line, you can literally be right in the middle of some of these different categories, some of these different attributes. And even if you're a little bit to the right, you'll still be considered a J or a P or whatever that looks like, right? Now, the problem with that is that it's not black and white, right? You could have, let's say, 1 out of 10 towards positive towards the judgment versus perception, right? And that's how decisive you are, whether you take decisions and really just jump in and do something, or whether you're saying, okay, I want to consider things and really think about, weigh my options a lot. Now, on the extremes of those things are obviously that's not going to really be very productive on either side. But in the middle, you kind of can go back and forth. But if you have even a little bit of tendency towards one side, that's going to be where you fall, and that's going to be where the assessment puts you. So saying that you are a P or a J or an I or an E, that doesn't tell the whole story. And so putting yourself in those boxes, you can see how that becomes very oversimplifying, and it takes away a lot of the ultimate choices that you have to be able to say, I'm going to choose to act this way in this situation. I'll choose to act this way in another situation. It also takes away the idea that you can change, because you can. There's certain characteristics that we have as humans that we can change, certain ones we can't, right? But our behaviors are things we can actually change. The first step is becoming aware of them. And the second one is actually taking those steps and saying, where do I want to go? What do I want to do differently? And acting differently on that. And we can very easily do that if we choose to. I wouldn't say easily. Over time, it becomes much easier. But we can do that if we choose to. But a lot of times people just choose not to, because it's easier not to do that. It's easier to just keep acting the way that you want to act, or the way that you've been acting, and not change anything. Transformation is very, very hard work. That's why coaching is such a big task to ask people to undertake for themselves. That's also why these assessments can be really powerful as a way to kick off a coaching engagement. Whenever possible, when I'm working with a client, I try to include these assessments as part of that engagement, because it just is a great kicking off point. They're not necessary per se. You don't have to have an assessment to start off a conversation about coaching, but it's helpful. And it's helpful because of the self-awareness piece that it brings to the table. It allows you to be more aware of who you are, where you're at right now, and where your possibilities or opportunities for growth are. So going back to the MBTI, if people choose to define themselves by these things and say that this is exactly what I am and all I am, then you're never going to have a growth mindset about anything. That becomes a very fixed mindset. But if you say this is where I am right now, right, you put that context to that, where it's a time box of, at the moment, here's where I'm at, here's where I'm at. And then you say, okay, here's where I want to be in 6 months or a year from now. Then suddenly it becomes a growth mindset situation. It becomes an opportunity to grow yourself and build who you want to be, and really be intentional about that. Unfortunately, a lot of people look at it that way. So I always say, look at the assessments as feedback, not definitive. That's not the definition of you. It's a piece of you. It's how you showed up that day. And that's the other piece of it. Any assessment you take is dependent on your mood and what's happening in your life on that particular day. That day is a subsection of your life. You could be having a great day and take an assessment and have some amazing results, or you could be having a really crappy day and take the assessment and have really shitty results, and anywhere in between, right? So your mood on that day, the day you take the assessment, is extremely important in terms of how it affects the outcomes of that assessment. Now, there are some assessments that ultimately will be they'll control for that, and they'll take into account the whole mood situation. They'll ask questions over and over again in certain ways that will kind of minimize the effect that mood has on the assessment results. But at the end of the day, there's not an assessment that really completely cuts out mood out of that situation. Because if you're depressed, for example, that's going to come across in your assessment, no matter what assessment you take. So consider that as well, that depending on what's going on in your life, if you're just busy as heck, I coached a ton of people last year who, on the MBTI, who were just extremely busy. They were overworked and they were just rushing through the assessment. And on one hand, that's, that doesn't give people a lot of time to think about their answers, so that they do give their first response, which is, typically who they are. But at the same time, if they're stressed out and frustrated and annoyed, then that first response is also not the one that they can control, right? It's not going to be their natural response. It's going to be their quick reaction response. So measured responses are also still where we're at. Because if you want to get a true snapshot of where you are in your development, in your leadership, in your personality, or any of that stuff, you want to be able to measure your tendency, but also how you ultimately will act. Because tendencies are only part of the picture, which is the whole conversation we're having right now, right? You can have a tendency and then not act on that tendency. Self-control is extremely important. And being able to use that emotional intelligence you've gained from the time of being a child to now is what really defines great leaders from good leaders, and good leaders from shitty leaders, right? If you're extremely insecure and your initial reaction is to push back and be like, oh, I'm not the problem, you're the problem, start pointing fingers, that's an immature response, right? But if you don't act in that response and you say, wait, okay, let me take a second here. I'm thinking very, very maturely. And your ultimate response and action is to say, let's take a step back and really examine and see where my responsibility lies here and where everyone else's lies. And we can actually be strategic in moving forward. That action is what defines your leadership, not just a mental response. We all have uncontrollable mental responses in our heads. But the part we can control is how we act on them, right? And so these assessments can give you a place to start thinking about that. So in summary, I would say that there's a couple of things to think about with assessments. One, where are you looking to invest your time and energy? If you're looking on leadership development specifically, look for a leadership assessment, like the Leadership Circle or the Hogan, or there's a bunch of other ones out there, the Korn Ferry as well. If you're looking on the personality side of things, you can look at the MBTI. That's a great one, and it's really commonly used. Be careful of a lot of these different websites, though, that have the MBTI online. Some of them are not going to be legit, and they're just going to give you some like dumbed down version that's going to give you the quick result that you can just put on your Instagram profile, like I'm an ENTJ, yay, great, based on 10 questions. That's not the MBTI. So just be careful, because some of them are kind of bastardized, for lack of a better term, to make them a little more digestible and more entertainment value versus actual development focused. But the other side of things is, don't define yourself by these assessments. These assessments don't tell you who you are. They tell you what your tendencies are. They tell you where you naturally are, where your natural proclivities are, right? Where you would go if you had no self-control at all. And so with that, you can say, I have this tendency to go in this direction. Here's where I actually really want to go. And I'm going to focus on that instead and really examine that piece of things. And then the last thing I would say is, just when you're looking at these assessments, understand that you can always have a plan of how to deal with them, right? You can always create a plan based on these things. They're built for self-awareness, not self-definition. Again, driving that point home. But that's a great kicking off point for any kind of self-development journey. All right. So take your time, think about what assessment you want to take, and talk to some coaches who are certified in those assessments, or some folks in general. It's not just coaches, but there's a lot of folks who are certified to deliver and debrief these assessments, and they can be really powerful in terms of being great tools for your self-development. I'm not saying I'm going to talk badly about any of them, because they all have their value, but there's some that are better than others. And so depending on what you're looking for, take your time, weigh your options, and really examine what you want to do for yourself. Thanks again for tuning in today, guys. Apologies, this video is kind of a little bit all over the place in the beginning, but hope it was valuable for you guys. Any questions, please feel free to post in the comment section below, and like and share the video if you thought it was valuable. And yeah, I'll see you guys again soon. Take care.